Hello and welcome back to our series on Bach's Orgelbüchlein. Today is one of those episodes where we're going to look at a particular topic. And today's topic was, what was it again? Tempo. Yes, that was it. Thank you, Frau Krankel. It's tempo, and we're going to look at it in the light of one of the miscellaneous chorale preludes towards the end of the collection, in dich, gehoffet, Herr. Of course, one of the great questions that we always have when we start to play a piece of Bach is how fast should we be playing it, at what speed should we be playing it? And that, to say this right at the start, is a question to which there is no one correct answer, although there might be several wrong answers. It would be great, wouldn't it, if we could, for example, have a recording of Bach playing his own works. But even that wouldn't give us one definitive answer, because what speed we play a work at depends on many factors, including the different room and the different building. And Bach himself would have chosen different speeds, I'm sure, at different stages of his life and in different circumstances. And then again, music is communication, and that's a kind of a three-way communication in a sense. We have the composer and the composer's intentions, what the composer wants to say with the music, and we have the performer who is trying to interpret it and communicating it to the third party, who is the listener. And the listener will have their own preconceptions, their own reactions to things. And so this communication is going to be very fluid. We can't expect or even want the listener necessarily to be listening with 18th century ears. The listener's world is a different one from that of Bach's listeners. But now, of course, we're straying into rather a philosophical question that we haven't got time to explore in this episode. So we'll get back to the business of tempo in this piece. How do we determine the right tempo? First of all, there's tempo markings. Many composers have used tempo markings through the ages. Bach was quite early on, so far as German composers are concerned, with using tempo markings, but in Orgelbüchlein he marks only 4 of the works with a tempo marking. There is Largo in Jesu meine Freude, and 3 pieces which have adagio markings. They are, if I remember rightly, Christum wir sollen loben schon, O Lamm Gottes unschuldig, and O Mensch bewein. O Mensch bewein is the one which has a very famous, first of all it's marked adagio assai, and then in the last couple of bars there is the very famous section which is marked adagissimo, which is quite extraordinary for Bach. So none of the pieces, in fact, in Orgelbüchlein are marked with lively or fast tempo markings, although these are things which Bach used elsewhere. You could argue, of course, that neither adagio nor largo are, strictly speaking, tempo markings. Adagio is ad agio, which means with ease, and largo is, as we all learnt as children, it means broadly, which is a surprisingly accurate word. Bach used adagio very obviously as a slow marking because he adds to it, he qualifies it as adagissimo or adagio assai when he wants it to be extra. And they are, of course, slow pieces that he applies it to. Largo, broadly, as I say, Bach's cousin J.S.Bach Walter actually wrote a treatise in which he wrote that largo means der Takt gleichsam erweiternd. In other words, the beat is somehow broadened, and qualifies it also as meaning langsam or slow. Another writer of a treatise, a German flautist, J.J. Quantz, he wrote that largo means heavier, that the beat becomes heavier. And what he had in mind, I think, there is that also the offbeats have something of an accent to them, which will make the general effect a little bit more ponderous. And we see that in Bach's piece, which is marked Largo here, which also is very, very thick in terms of figuration, extraordinarily so, which will lend it this air of slight ponderousness. So we can take both Largo and Adagio as a form of tempo indication. But the problem with all these kinds of descriptions is that they are relative. If we understand that a particular piece is to be played slower than usual, then we still have the question of slower than what, if we can't quantify what usual was in an 18th century context. Bach's first biographer, Orgelbüchlein, remarked that Bach generally chose a lively tempo, but that again is only a relative term, lively as compared with whom. So it doesn't help us in establishing anything like a fixed tempo. Handel included timings in one or two of his oratorios, written in the margins, which, when you compare them with modern-day performance timings, suggests a very brisk tempo indeed. Although just on the spur of the moment, I do wonder now whether Handel would have included the overture in his timings, given that an overture was regarded as something as an extra, and that would regularize the timings rather to roughly what we would expect today. In any event, we don't get the impression that music was played a great deal slower in the 18th century. Another way we have of establishing tempo is, oddly enough, mechanical barrel organs, played with a clockwork mechanism, which means that we can play them at the tempo that they were played at in the 18th century. And there again, organ music that is played on barrel organs of this sort tends to be at a very brisk tempo. On the other hand, of course, you could argue that they were the height of technology, and so they would inevitably be a little bit flash, a little bit faster perhaps than the norm would be. But all these things together, they all indicate that the expected tempo in the 18th century was not any slower than we would expect it today. To look at this question of tempo, I've deliberately chosen a chorale prelude that doesn't have any kind of tempo marking. In dich, gehoffet, Herr. The work itself, the hymn on which it's based, is a metrical paraphrase of Psalm 31, which speaks of God as a rock and a fortress and a place to turn to when in distress. So it's, as often happens, it's not a sad tune as such, or a sad hymn, but it's a very contemplative one. It certainly isn't upbeat or jolly in any sense. If we look at the first phrase, we can see the chorale melody there in crotchets and a very straightforward cha-cha-chum figuration in the left hand. And that all gives the impression of a fairly normal tempo. Crotchet is 60 or something like that. Something like this. But when we look more closely at the harmonic rhythm, we find that the harmonies are all moving in quavers. So whatever the actual notes feel like, we're going to have to take our time in order for the ear to be able to absorb the changing harmonies. And to cut a long story short, if we get to the final phrase, we find that the harmonic rhythm accelerates even more, right down to the semiquaver level, and the figuration becomes very dense and compact. I'll just play the last phrase. So it's possible to play that at a faster tempo, but you couldn't possibly listen to it because you wouldn't be able to follow the logic of the harmonies. It would sound a complete jumble. So this is what I mean when I say that the harmonic rhythm is the best objective measure of a tempo. It's possible to play it faster, but if you tried to listen to it, you wouldn't be able to make sense of what it's doing. So one way of judging the harmonic rhythm is to make a kind of synopsis of the harmonies, write out what each chord effectively is that's being split up by all the figuration, and work out how often those harmonies are changing and what kind of speed is going to be appropriate to detect and to appreciate the logic of what's going on. But of course you can't establish one tempo which is going to be right for any particular piece in all situations. There are so many different factors that play into it. One of them is the building and the instrument, of course. A large building with a long resonance suggests a slower tempo than a small building with a dry acoustic and a very responsive little organ. Many years ago, I played a concert in Norway for the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, NRK, in a small wooden stave church with a very beautiful new Swedish organ. The acoustic was extremely dry, and the organ was very small, as I say, and responsive, and all of that together made it necessary to take quite rapid tempi. I remember I played a Bach trio sonata and various other things, and when it was broadcast, I found that the Broadcasting Corporation had added electronic resonance to the sound, which meant that the tempi suddenly had become way too fast, and it sounded rushed. And I was rather cross with them, of course, at the time for having done that without telling me, and certainly without telling me in advance. But it was an object lesson in how much difference the acoustics of a room actually make to the tempo. And then again, we as people are not machines. We have different feelings, we have different moods, and it's inevitable that those are going to affect the way in which we play from one time to another. And also the audience, the people who are listening, we're going to be influenced by who is listening in what circumstances. So, for example, if we were playing for an audience that was attending a meditative retreat, then we might well find ourselves playing more slowly, rightly or wrongly, than if we were playing for an audience of teenagers. And I think it's quite right we should to some extent be influenced in this way, because we are in the business of communicating, and if we don't adapt the way in which we communicate to the people that we're playing it for, then we're not doing our job. So if we can sum up with one general rule, apart from understanding the chorale in a chorale prelude, it would be to understand the grammar of the music, the way in which the music is operating. And that will give us a lot of clues to the tempo. So let's try in dich, gehoffet, bearing in mind those two things in particular. Firstly, the nature of the chorale itself, and secondly, the harmonic complexities of those last two bars, and see if we can find an optimal tempo that will communicate the music, especially in terms of those challenging final two bars.